Okay, now to introduce our keynote presentation, please welcome one of our 40 Under 40 honorees, Shanti Katona from the Wilmington office of Pulcinelli.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker. Jan Crawford is CBS News' chief legal correspondent and contributes regularly to CBS Evening News, CBS This Morning, Face the Nation, as well as CBS News Radio and CBSNews.com. Crawford is a recognized authority on the Supreme Court, and her 2007 book, Supreme Conflict, The Inside Story of the Struggle for the Control of the United States Supreme Court, gained critical acclaim and became an instant New York Times bestseller. She began covering the court in 1994 for the Chicago Tribune and went on to become a law and political correspondent for ABC News, as well as a Supreme Court analyst for PBS prior to joining CBS News. Chief Justice Roberts actually granted his first television network interview to Crawford, and it was just one of the 5 rare interviews that she's been able to get with members of our highest court. She also has sat down with Justice Stevens, Justice Scalia, Justice Thomas, as well as Justice Breyer. Earlier this year, she also had the privilege of sitting down and speaking with Attorney General Barr for an exclusive interview on CBS following the release of the Miller Report. Crawford began her journalistic career in Chicago at the Tribune in 1987. She joined the legal affairs beat in 1993 after her graduation from the University of Chicago Law School. A native of Alabama, she graduated from the University of Alabama in 1987, and she's taught journalism at American University. She frequently speaks about the United States Supreme Court to universities, law schools, legal organizations, and civic groups across the country. Please join me in welcoming Jan Crawford.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction in this video. Wow. It's really great to be here today, and I've so enjoyed meeting some of you beforehand. What a terrific program you guys have put together. Even this luncheon has been pretty amazing. I loved hearing from Congresswoman Porter, and such a wonderful tribute to Judge Hale. So thank you again for having me for the luncheon and for being in Washington this week. I mean, the timing is pretty hard to top. And I'm not talking about that impeachment vote yesterday. Our nationals, if you can stay in town, the parade's going to be on Saturday. So that should be something exciting as well. I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon about the court in the time of Donald Trump, how the process has changed, and what we're already starting to see up there on some of the dynamics that are emerging. But I think to really understand where we are today, we kind of have to turn the clock back. Go back 30 years. I mean, let's go back to 1990, 1991, with the nominations of David Souter and Clarence Thomas, who both replaced 2 liberal giants on the Supreme Court, William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall. And then a couple years later, we got Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, by the way, is doing fine. She is back on the bench, active as ever, and shows no signs of slowing down or going anywhere. So the next year, after Justice Ginsburg, who was, of course, nominated by President Clinton, came on board, then we got Justice Stephen Breyer in 1994, which was the year I started covering the Supreme Court. And that, unbeknownst to any of us at the time, that Supreme Court, with those 9 justices, would remain intact for the next 11 years. It was a period of historic stability for the Supreme Court. The longest time in history that the Supreme Court, with 9 justices, had gone without a change in membership. And for conservatives, it was a time of great hope and what they thought was great promise. There were 7 justices on that Rehnquist court nominated by Republican presidents. 7. You had 2 new justices who had replaced liberal giants. So there was this tremendous hope that the Supreme Court was now poised to undo what conservatives saw as the kind of great excesses of the liberal Warren Court. But that was not to be. I mean, what did I do? But this, I don't know if this is going to portend the Trump court. Does this mean it's going to call, anyway. But I mean, really, if you think about that court, the Rehnquist court that remained intact that long, on case after case on social issue, that court with those 7 justices nominated by Republican presidents not only did not undo some of those liberal rulings, but they put Roe versus Wade on more solid ground than ever before. They refused to overturn affirmative action. They kept up that kind of solid wall between church and state, and that's what we used to think about when we talked about the wall up at the Supreme Court. So, I mean, on really kind of every social issue, it appeared that conservatives had lost. But I think to understand that, and to understand this court, we have to think about what those disappointments for conservatives actually did, because the disappointments and the perceived mistakes of past Republican presidents have really guided future Republican presidents and given us the new justices that we now have on the court, and have again given conservatives great hope that this court now has firmly turned to the right. And so under these last 2 Republican administrations, that of George W. Bush and now President Trump, the selection process has really changed. And it's a result, like I said, I think, of some of these past disappointments. And I've kind of identified like 3 general signposts when you're looking at the judicial selection process and how this court came to be. 1, vetting. Extensive, exhaustive vetting. Number 2, kind of what I like to call the spine test. Are they going to melt under the glare of the media, the New York Times editorial page, the Georgetown cocktail party crowd? And then number 3, that kind of intangible, the dynamics that the justices bring to the court, because a new justice, the saying goes, makes a new court. Now, the question, and it will be years before we know the answer to this, is whether or not these more recent Republican nominees will change this court in a way that past presidents have tried to do and failed. The court is kind of like a snapshot, a picture of the court in time. And so right now we have a picture of a new Supreme Court led by Chief Justice John Roberts, with 2 new justices now nominated and confirmed by President Trump. But that snapshot's like a Polaroid picture. You know, it's still blurry. It's going to take years for us to really get a much sharper focus to see if there is going to be lasting, dramatic change. But when we think about the new justices and how they got here, I think we need to talk about how these 2 most recent Republican presidents approached their process and why they believe and why conservatives now believe that things are going to be different this time. The first, like I was talking about, is that number 1 guidepost that they did in their selection process so that they wouldn't make the mistakes, quote, of the past. And there was one big mistake. And those of you who follow the court know exactly who I'm talking about, and that was, of course, Justice Souter. If you think back to that vetting process, it was pretty much, he's a great guy, and he's conservative. We know he's conservative. I mean, look at him. He wears a 3-piece suit. He's nice to his mom. He's got good manners. It wasn't an extensive vetting process. And so when Justice Souter got on the Supreme Court as the stealth nominee, without the paper trail of Robert Bork, who's going to be sneaked onto the Supreme Court, fool the Democrats, and be a solid conservative vote. After Justice Souter was confirmed to the Supreme Court, of course, we all know what happened. The only person he fooled was the Republicans. He became one of the most predictably liberal justices, voting consistently with the liberals. So when you hear the phrase no more Souters, what that meant was no more stealth nominees like David Souter. And as a result of that, the White House of George W. Bush, the White House of President Trump put in extensive vetting procedures, teams of lawyers poring over every word of opinions, academic papers, to ensure that the nominee that they were putting up there was going to be a solid judicial conservative. I know in the Bush White House, one of the Bush Deputy White House Counsel, Bill Kelly, was one who led a lot of the vetting. And he said once of Justice Alito, he's never written a wrong opinion. And he should know, he analyzed every word of his opinions, as did teams of lawyers, again, to try to get those more known quantities on the Supreme Court. And I think Trump's vetting process was much the same. Very rigorous, led by a team of lawyers in the White House, and they worked off the list that Trump had released as a candidate. Now, if you guys remember that, when Trump was running and we heard that he was going to have a list of candidates that he would put on the Supreme Court, I mean, a lot of people were like, okay, yeah, right, who's he going to put, like Judge Judy? Who's Trump going to put on the Supreme Court? But that list was conventional. It was establishment. It was the kind of list that you have expected from, and I covered the Romney campaign, that's the kind of judges that, say, a President Romney would have looked at. I mean, it was, like I said, developed by the legal organizations, conservative legal organizations, and so he said he was going to work off that list, and he did, and then he updated it again, put Kavanaugh's name, and they continued to work off that, vetting that, going through the list, and in the first, when he was looking for his first appointment, Neil Gorsuch began to emerge as a favorite. The vetting was extensive. He had been a judge, of course, many years on the 10th Circuit. And, by the time he got to his interview with President Trump, I mean, he looked like someone at a central casting. He aced the interview, and Gorsuch was seen as someone who had a solid judicial philosophy, would not change, and pretty much wowed President Trump. But not so fast. There's that second guidepost that they were looking for, and that is that spine test that I was talking about. There is a rap on some of the justices, and conservatives always complain about this, that it doesn't happen with the liberal justices. They stay liberal, but they believe that the conservative justices, when they're nominated, go to the Supreme Court, and the next thing you know, the media starts saying terrible things about them, and the New York Times editorial page starts reaming them out, and the professors in the law schools and academia start writing critical things about them, and then none of the international scholars, when they go overseas, are nice to them. So there's this thinking among some conservatives that conservative justices have a tendency to shift, to, quote, evolve over time. And that was the rap that was always on Justice Anthony Kennedy. Although I think you could kind of argue with that, but many people believe that he came up here, started worrying about what the New York Times was saying, worrying about the international crowd, and began to cast votes in a more liberal way. So, Bush White House, Trump White House, spine test. They were going to look for nominees who not only had a solid judicial philosophy, but who had been through the storm, who could take the harsh light of the media, who weren't going to melt under the bright lights. And that's, Gorsuch fit all of those as well. He'd been here in D.C. His mother had worked in the Reagan administration, a controversial tenure as head of the EPA. He'd seen the kind of things the media could do. He'd written controversial decisions as a judge. In fact, his mother actually wrote a book about her career called Are You Tough Enough? And so far, I think we can say, Gorsuch has proven to be, for conservatives, tough enough. I mean, he has been very consistently reliable vote for conservatives. They saw Judge Kavanaugh in much the same way. He had worked in the Bush White House. He had been a judge on the D.C. Circuit. He knew kind of the meat grinder of Washington. They thought, would get on the Supreme Court. And again, not only solid judicial philosophy, but he wasn't going to melt. That spine was going to stay strong. And then that brings us to our third guidepost. And that's how justices can affect the court, conservative, strong, justices can affect the court in unexpected ways. And that's the story of Justice Thomas, who came onto the Supreme Court, as you know, back in 1991. And I do give a lot of talks to law schools, and I've learned a few years ago now, because you would always say, if you think back to 1991 and those brutal confirmation hearings, and it just dawned on me that, they weren't even born in 1991. But if we think back to 1991, he'd just come out of those brutal confirmation hearings, went on the Supreme Court, battered, missed some of the first argument sessions, and the narrative very quickly emerged on Justice Thomas that he was following Justice Scalia, that he was unqualified for the Supreme Court, that he had no idea what he was doing. He didn't deserve to be up there, and certainly not replacing such a liberal giant as Thurgood Marshall. And that narrative is completely, demonstrably false. When I was doing research for my book, The Papers of Justice Harry Blackmun, and people can say what they want to about Justice Blackmun, but let me tell you what, he is a great note taker. So his papers are all in the Library of Congress. And throughout the papers, you can see how wrong the narrative about Justice Thomas was, that to this day, I think, still persists. A lot of people really believe that Justice Thomas was just a lackey, a puppet of the great intellectual Antonin Scalia. That was never the case. It wasn't true starting on Justice Thomas's first week on the bench. And it's all in the papers of Justice Blackmun. If you go to the Library of Congress, Justice Blackmun took very detailed notes after a conference. And you know how the conferences work. The justices on Wednesdays and again on Fridays, it's just the 9 of them in a room. They all sit around a table, a big, beautiful conference room off the chambers of the Chief Justice. No secretaries, no law clerks. Someone knocks on the door. The junior justice has to jump up and answer it. So Justice Breyer will joke that he had that job for the longest time in history as the junior justice. And the Chief Justice told me once that it was really funny when Justice Alito came on board and became the new junior justice, that someone knocked on the door, and Justice Breyer instinctively jumped up to get it. So he had to learn that he was no longer the junior. But in that first week when Justice Thomas was on the bench for his conference, everything at the court is by seniority. Even how they take the bench is by seniority. And so the way it works is the Chief Justice will start a conversation, say what he thinks about a particular case that they've heard arguments on, and then it goes around the table with each justice saying a few words and then how they're going to vote. And so Justice Blackmun would write notes, what the justice said, and then how they were going to vote. And so you can kind of get a sense of where the justices are going to be, and then you can take the memos and follow that and see the final product and what happened. And did justices change their minds, or did people switch sides? And it did happen sometimes. And in Justice Thomas's first week, his first conference, it happened then. This was a case involving an inmate from Louisiana who was in a mental institution. He'd been found not guilty by reason of insanity. He wanted out. The state of Louisiana wanted to keep him there. So, and the issue was a burden of proof issue. And so the conversation went around the room in the conference. Every justice, the conservatives and the liberals, had voted in that conference to side with the inmate, whose name was Terry Fuchsia. And then it got to Justice Thomas, and he haltingly said he would cast his vote with the rest of his colleagues and vote against the state of Louisiana. Justice Thomas could not sleep that night. The next morning, he got up, he went to court, met with the Chief Justice, and said, I've thought about this. I threw in the towel. That's not how I see this case. I want to change my vote. So the Chief Justice, then William Rehnquist, said, okay, had this booming baritone. I'm not going to try it. I mean, you can, some of the bankrupt talent, maybe you guys could do that next. Try your different Supreme Court justice voices. But Justice Rehnquist had this deep one. So he said, okay, that's fine. Write your dissent and circulate it. So Justice Thomas wrote his dissent in this case, circulated it around, and that's how they typically do. They don't spend a lot of time, going back and forth, walking the hallways. It's in the writings. After he circulated that dissent, a few days later, Justice Scalia sent a note around saying he was changing his vote. A few days after that, the Chief Justice, he was changing his vote. Another day or so after that, Justice Kennedy changing his vote. That case ended up being 5-4, started out 9-0. Those justices changed their votes on the strength of Justice Thomas's written dissent. That happened the first week he was on the court, and it happened several other times that year, where he would take a position at conference alone, and Justice Scalia would later change his vote to join him. But that wasn't the storyline that you read about in the papers. That's not what the media wrote. The media would see Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia voting together and say, there goes Thomas following Scalia again. And I think that's something that is important for us to remember when we read coverage, including mine, of this current Supreme Court, because we don't know. We know what the writings are, but right now we don't know what's really happening behind the scenes. We don't know the emerging dynamics. We have some clues here and there, but my message is take everything with a grain of salt. Because not only did that term, Justice Thomas, go his own path, never a lackey of Justice Scalia, but that created this internal dynamic in the court that later would shape how President Bush and President Trump were thinking about their nominees. Justice O'Connor was always a pragmatist, former legislator, obviously an incredibly important historical figure as the first female on the Supreme Court, an inspirational figure to many, including me, and other women of my generation. She didn't like the kind of strong language that she was seeing in these opinions. Justice Thomas's willingness in his first year to argue the court should rethink established precedents, including some decisions that she had written herself, particularly on habeas corpus. And you could see this in the papers and in the writings of Justice Blackmun as well, that created this internal dynamic on the Supreme Court that caused Justice O'Connor to kind of back away. And that is the term when you see her begin to cast her vote more with some of the liberal justices. Because remember what I said, a new justice can mean a new court. Alliances get rethought, dynamics can change, positions reconsidered whenever someone else starts making different points, different arguments. The Supreme Court is a group of 9, and it is a deliberative place. And as a result of some of those strong arguments, you see Justice O'Connor really moving more toward the center or center-left on some cases. She didn't join a single one of Justice Thomas's opinions that year. Even in cases where they both were in the majority, she wrote separately. That internal dynamic then, I think, became more accentuated because of Justice Breyer, who does like to talk. If you guys have met Justice Breyer, he likes to talk. He likes to talk to his colleagues. He likes to hash things out. When he first joined the bench, bless his heart, the media wrote a lot of stories about how he would just go on and on with these crazy questions, which he didn't really appreciate. But so he's tried to tailor it back. But he's a very engaging man, former law professor, of course. And he spent a lot of time talking to Justice Breyer, occasionally talking to Justice Kennedy. And he believes, and other justices do as well, that that also makes a difference. If you're willing to just talk, maybe people will listen, and maybe they might change their minds. Those are those internal dynamics that can have an impact. And that was also something when this White House and the White House of George Bush were thinking, how can they make their nominations solid in ways that past presidents had failed? Internal dynamics was something that they thought about. Chief Justice John Roberts was seen as someone who was congenial, collegial, collaborative. Justice Alito, widely seen as a great colleague. Justice Gorsuch, someone with great polish, intellect, who would go on the court. People would have great respect for him. And Justice Kavanaugh, someone who had worked in the White House, understood how things worked, understood how to get things done behind the scenes, wouldn't alienate people. Those were all things that went into their thinking in terms of how they were making their selection process. I think it's much too soon to say how this is going to play out. Now, as I've said, that snapshot is still blurry. But it's interesting to see some of the dynamics we're already starting to see emerge. Justice Kagan, for example. She had that famous friendship with Justice Scalia. She went hunting with him in Louisiana. I always wish I could have gone along for that duck hunt. But several of them, in fact. But she's been very welcoming to Justice Kavanaugh. She hired him when she was dean at Harvard Law School to teach constitutional law. Justice Breyer is continuing his great efforts to persuade. And, I think as this court now seems to have been shifted to the right, when we think about a new justice making a new court, what does that mean for some of the justices who've been on just a little longer? What about the Chief Justice? Is he now the new center of the court? He was supposed to be this great, solid conservative, but already he's been somewhat of a disappointment to some conservatives on the court and outside the court. His vote, for example, to uphold President Obama's signature legislation in the Obamacare case caused great anger inside the court among the conservative justices, not to mention outside the court among some of the politicians. Much has been made about this emerging, quote, bromance with the Chief Justice and Justice Kavanaugh. Are they going to be now the two kind of center figures of the Supreme Court? Something to watch. It's too soon to see. But you can see it in some alignments already in cases and how they conduct themselves during the oral arguments. One thing that's interesting about oral argument is the justices tend to tip their hands. So we can leave a case and think we have a pretty good idea of how the court's going to rule. Not with Justice Kavanaugh. He does not tip his hand. He asks questions on both sides. So he can be kind of, I'd say, difficult to read. It's hard to say if that's going to last. I mean, Justice Alito, when he joined the court, he made a conscious decision not to ask questions or dominate in his first year. When he went on the Third Circuit, he was much too aggressive, he thought, and started arguing that the Third Circuit panels needed to rethink cases, and he thought that had rubbed some of his colleagues the wrong way. So he made a decision when he went to the Supreme Court that he was going to kind of get a feel for the neighborhood before he started, telling people they need to paint their house a different color. So I don't know, again, this term, I think, will give us a lot of clues. Last term, Justice Kavanaugh's first, obviously, on the bench, and then preceding that, Justice Gorsuch. Very quiet term. And I think that was intentional. The court kind of wanted to just lie low after the brutal Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. This term is not going to be like that. What are the most controversial social issues that face our society now? I mean, you would say abortion, gun rights, gay rights, race. This Supreme Court will consider all of those. In addition, they've got a case next week that looks at President Obama's Dreamers program and whether or not he had the authority to implement that without approval from Congress. President Trump is challenging that. So you've got immigration and presidential power also on the docket. All of these things will occupy this Supreme Court. So we will get some more clues at the end of this term. But all of these cases will come down, as you know, in May or June. And what is that? Right smack dab in the middle of a presidential election. So I guess I would like to kind of leave you with this, and I know we've got to be out of here in 10 minutes, and I wanted to leave time for questions, but so I'm kind of just rushing through some of this, and then we'll have questions if you want, or I can just keep talking. But we can't stay longer than 3:15 because Justice Gorsuch has another panel, and I do not want to be responsible for making anyone late for that. So, but I think that, I guess what I'd like to end with is a kind of a plea. Having covered the court now for 25 years, being in Washington for 25 years, covering judicial nominations and selections, and I cover appellate court, district court nominations too, and Trump is transforming the lower courts, as you know, using a lot of these guideposts that I've been talking about. I would like I guess I could, when I say a plea, it's less to people in this room, but maybe when you're talking to your friends and neighbors, and I certainly try to do it in my business. The court is the one institution, I think, in Washington that works, and public opinion remains high. Marquette University just did a poll a couple weeks ago, and the public views the court positively almost 3 times higher, in fact, than the White House or Congress. And I think that's important for the functioning of our democracy. And it's justified. Say what you about the Supreme Court, about the justices, their ideologies, the way they interpret the Constitution, the way they interpret the law, the statutes. They are 9 really smart people. And they're engaged in this kind of struggle over ideas and philosophies and how to approach issues and originalism, textualism. I mean, it's a highly intellectual place done at a very high level, and it's been my great privilege. My favorite times of the year are June, when I sit there in the Supreme Court and I think I cannot wait to see how they figure this out. You know, these complicated problems that divided really smart people in the lower courts below. How are they going to get themselves out of this one? What are they going to decide? And that's why I find it so disturbing when we see a lot of this rhetoric on the right from this White House, but also on the left, and not just from politicians, but from interest groups, that, you know, the court is political, because it's not. I mean, once you get through this confirmation and nomination process, which I've kind of briefly outlined, and then they go through the ringer of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which, by the way, if Congresswoman Porter were still here, a lot of senators want to be on the Judiciary Committee because of nominations, and California has a fine senator on the Judiciary Committee right now, but some of the things she was saying, that sounds like a really good committee for her if she ever wants to run for Senate, so you might want to pass that down. But, you know, we see President Trump, and he says, you know, judges basically are political. You know, this Obama judge that took issue with his asylum program, which of course prompted a really rare and unusual rebuke from the Chief Justice. And then just this week, you know, former presidential candidate and Secretary Hillary Clinton taking a shot at President Trump's judges as being ideologues and unqualified and lacking experience. Again, there's a lot of things you could say about Trump judges, like you don't agree with them or how they view the law or the Constitution, but it's a mistake to say that they're not qualified and that Republicans don't take nominations seriously. Elections matter. A president's nominations to the Supreme Court and the federal courts, but especially the Supreme Court, that's his lasting legacy. President Trump and Republican presidents before him, Democratic presidents, President Clinton, knew those stakes. They've tried now, with the last 2 nominations, to turn the court more firmly to the right. But like I said, that blurry photo has yet to come in focus. Whether or not President Trump, President George W. Bush succeeded in ways that past Republican presidents have failed, we may not know that for years. They've made dramatic change on the Supreme Court. And then, you know, with 2 justices now in their 80s, 2 liberal justices in their 80s, who's to say what the court will even look like in 5 years? So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you so much for having me, and elections matter. Anyway, thank you. And with that, I think I've saved enough time for some questions if anybody has questions. Or if you guys want to just make sure you're on time for Justice Gorsuch. But I think we've got about 4 minutes for questions. Does anybody? Yes, sir?
Yes, hi there. I'm Dan Cohn from Boston. I was intrigued by your observation that after the Obamacare decision, some of the conservative justices were angry.
That's right.
And I'm just wondering, you've also described this dynamic where they meet together twice a week and, of course, have interactions besides that. Can you comment on the personal relationships within the court as you understand them?
Absolutely. I mean, the Obamacare decision, inside the court, the conservative justices saw that as a great betrayal by John Roberts. They believed that he was with them during the conference and that he was going to strike down that law as violating the Constitution, specifically the individual mandate. And they believed that he basically bowed under the pressure, which was extreme. There were op-eds, people were writing articles, congressmen, everyone pointing really the glare on John Roberts. And there was a really kind of a tremendous effort inside the court, led by Justice Kennedy, who, as I kind of had said earlier, gets the rap for being squishy and, that human jump ball, you throw him up and you're not really sure where he's going to land, left or right. I mean, Justice Kennedy drives conservatives crazy. But on this one, he was solid. And he made tremendous efforts and wrote significant portions of what would become a dissent once it became clear that the Chief Justice was changing his vote to persuade the Chief Justice to rejoin the ranks, which ultimately they realized failed, and then they just quit trying to talk to him because he was trying to get more than 5 votes for a majority. And that's something that the Chief Justice has talked about. He thinks it's better for the court if they can speak with a more united, unanimous voice, which in practice sounds great, but in reality, these are the most complex issues of our time that they're often grappling with. They frequently divided, like I said, some of the brightest legal minds in the country and the lower courts below. They're hard issues. Unanimity is not always going to be possible. There will be divisions. Obviously, in the vast majority of cases, they're not 5-4, but the ones that we talk about, the ones that are on the front page of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and newspapers across the country, the ones that people get riled up about and protest about, those typically will be 5-4. After that decision, there was tremendous anger in the court at the Chief Justice. They just felt that he had made a decision that was not based on the law, but was instead based on things that shouldn't matter. That was based on the court's standing, how people viewed the court in the public, how people viewed John Roberts. That has subsided now. I think Roberts has actually just tried to keep his head down, and it seems like they're all kind of, they've moved on. And that's what they have to do. I mean, they talk about that a fair amount. I mean, after Bush versus Gore, that was a hard time for the Supreme Court. But, there are 9 people, and they know that 9 people may have different views. And so they put those behind them and go on to the next case. Justice O'Connor was always great about that. She was always like, today's another day. We've got another case. That was yesterday. That was past. And she is missed greatly up at the Supreme Court, just her presence. She was a cohesive person. She would organize dinners. They just had a really kind of more, collegial, I don't want to say familial, but a relationship when she was up there as a result of her. And they talk about that. I mean, Justice Breyer told me the other day, we did an event down in North Carolina together and just how much they miss her. So it's a new, it's like when you got new relatives at Thanksgiving, you got new people around the table and everybody's got to get used to each other again. So that's where they are now. They've gone out of their way, and I think this is notable, to welcome Justice Kavanaugh. They showed up, when he was getting his official kind of swearing in. They've gone out of their way at the court to be engaging with him, even at argument. They go out of their way. And I'm not talking about the conservatives. I mean the liberals, like Justice Kagan, Justice Ginsburg, Justice Sotomayor. So they go out of their way to be collegial. Maybe there's a little of that there too, though, with like the internal dynamics where they're hoping that they may be able to persuade him to kind of not be so conservative. Because one thing that we don't know is how he'll react to his confirmation hearings. Obviously, Justice Thomas went through those brutal hearings and emerged as someone who did not care what was said about him. And so, he said he told his story to the media. Not only did they not print it, but they printed a story that someone else had said that he believed was false during the Anita Hill hearings. And as a result, he does not care what the press says, what the academia say. He doesn't care. I'm not sure Justice Kavanaugh is like that. So that's going to be something, I think, interesting to see, and whether or not he and the Chief Justice will kind of be this more kind of core middle, and then you would have the three more solid conservatives, to the right of them. Again, time will tell. Anything else? Is Justice Gorsuch going to be mad? Are we done? All right. I just want to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here with you.